A 9-year-old girl walked 6 blocks through a Kentucky thunderstorm clutching a cardboard box. Inside it, a silver pocket watch that belonged to a dead man's son. The son, 6'2", 200 pounds of scar tissue and silence, hadn't cried in 11 years. He cried that night. But here's what nobody in Ash Hollow is talking about. The man who wanted that watch back wasn't sentimental. He was dangerous. And the people trying to keep that little girl's family on the street, they were about to find out what happens when a broken veteran with nothing left to lose decides to start caring again. Stay until the end of this one. It will wreck you. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. Where are you watching from tonight? The rain came in sideways that Thursday evening, the kind that didn't fall so much as a tack, driving hard off the ridgeline north of town and slamming into the storefronts along Meridian Street like it had a grudge. Gutters ran brown and fast. Street signs shuddered on their poles. The neon in the window of Vale's Cycle Works buzzed and flickered, the red letters bleeding into the wet pavement below, and the whole block smelled like wet asphalt and old exhaust and something faintly electrical, the way air smells just before something breaks. Gideon Vale was on his knees behind the service counter when the last customer left. Not praying, Otan, he hadn't done that since Kandahar, but sorting through a box of carburetor gaskets he'd been meaning to inventory for 3 weeks. The shop was quiet, except for the rain against the corrugated roof and the low hum of the space heater in the corner. He was 44 years old, and every inch of him felt like it. His knees ached against the concrete. His lower back had been making a sound lately, a dull, grinding pop when he twisted wrong, the kind of sound a machine makes when something internal has worn past the point of recovery. He stood up slowly, braced one hand on the counter, and looked around the shop the way he did every night before closing. Not out of pride, but out of habit. The habit of a man who needed to know exactly what he had left. 3 bikes in various stages of disassembly, a pegboard of tools above the secondary bench, most of the hooks filled, a few conspicuously bare where things had been sold off over the past year to make payroll. The walls were hung with photographs, race placards, old club patches under glass, things that belonged to a version of this place that no longer existed, the version where there had been 4 mechanics and a parts runner, and a Saturday line of customers out to the sidewalk. Now there was Gideon, there was Marcus, who came in 3 days a week and didn't ask questions, and there was the quiet, which had its own weight. He pulled his jacket off the hook by the back door, black leather, heavy, the back panel blank where a patch had been removed years ago with something close to surgical precision, the stitching still visible like a scar, and shrugged it on. He killed the overhead fluorescents, leaving only the work lamp above the service counter. He was reaching for the breaker panel when he heard it. A knock, soft, uncertain, the kind that expected refusal. He turned. Through the smeared glass of the front door, he could see a shape under the awning, small and dark against the sheets of rain beyond. He stood still for a moment, watching. The shape didn't move, didn't try the handle, just waited, the way only 2 kinds of people wait, the very patient or the very scared. He crossed the shop floor in 4 strides and opened the door. The girl was maybe 9. Soaked through completely, her hair plastered flat against her skull, her sneakers so wet they were making a sound with every shift of her weight. She wore a thin windbreaker over a school sweatshirt, and neither was doing anything useful against the cold. She was holding a cardboard box against her chest with both arms wrapped around it, protecting it the way you'd protect something breakable, something that mattered. She looked up at him with eyes that were brown and serious and not frightened, which surprised him. Most people flinched from Gideon Vale's face. The nose had been broken in 4 different places across 3 different decades. The scar along his jaw came from a blade in a city he'd spent years trying to forget. The lines around his eyes weren't from laughter. He was not a face that invited approach. Children, especially. Children had good instincts about faces like his. This one looked at him like she was making an assessment, the way you look at a road before deciding whether to cross it. "You Gideon Vale," she said. Her voice was steady, a little raspy, like she'd been out in the cold longer than just this block. "Who's asking?" he said. "Wren Mercer." She adjusted her grip on the box. "I found something that belongs to you." He stepped back and let her in, not because he'd decided to exactly, but because it seemed wrong to leave her standing in the rain another second. She came in without hesitation, leaving wet footprints on the concrete. She looked around the shop once, brief and practical, cataloging it, then looked back at him. He was already looking at the box. It was a shoebox with the flaps folded shut. She set it on the service counter carefully, with both hands, as though setting down a sleeping animal. Then she stepped back and put her hands in the front pocket of her windbreaker and watched him. He opened the flaps. The watch lay on a folded square of paper towel. Silver, round, slightly tarnished along the engraved edge. The chain coiled beneath it in a loose oval. The glass face was intact. The second hand was moving. The ticking was so loud in the empty shop that it felt like it was coming from inside his own chest. He had not heard that sound in 3 days. 3 days of searching through the same drawers and pockets over and over, retracing the same steps in his mind, refusing to accept what he already suspected, that it was gone. That the last tangible thing his father had ever placed in his hands was gone, and that it was probably sitting in a glass case somewhere by now with a $40 price tag. He stood very still with his hands on either side of the box and said nothing for a long moment. "Where?" he said finally. "Parking lot behind the library." She hadn't moved. "It was in the gutter. The chain was caught on the drain cover, or it would have gone down." He picked the watch up, turned it over. On the back, engraved in his father's handwriting, the man had paid a jeweler in Lexington to do it the year Gideon shipped out for the first time. 5 words. "Do right by your people." The engraving was worn shallow in places, but still legible. Still his father's voice in metal. He set the watch down. He looked at the girl. "You know what this is worth?" he said. "I figured it was valuable," she said. "It's old." "So you brought it here?" I asked around. "Someone on my street said the watch shop on Meridian belonged to the guy on Meridian." She paused. Didn't know which one until Ms. Patton at the library looked it up. He stared at her. "You went to the library. In this weather." "Library closes at 6. I had to go before school let out." She said it like it was obvious, like it was simply the sequence of events required to accomplish the task. Something moved in Gideon's chest that he couldn't immediately identify, something that was not quite pain and not quite anything else. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Vince Calder didn't offer you anything for it?" The girl's expression shifted very slightly. Not fear. Something more like careful neutrality. "He offered me $30. And you said no." I said no. Gideon looked at her for a long time. He didn't have words exactly, which was nothing unusual. He hadn't been a man who reached for words easily in decades. What he had was the weight of the watch in his palm, and the sound of the rain on the roof, and the sight of this girl in her wet windbreaker standing in his shop like the most ordinary, extraordinary thing he'd ever seen. "Sit down," he said, and pointed to the old wooden stool behind the counter. "You're not walking back out in that." She sat. She unzipped her windbreaker and hung it on the edge of the stool and looked around the shop with the same calm, cataloging attention she'd given it when she first walked in. He went to the back and came back with a towel and a cup of instant coffee with too much sugar in it, because that was all he had for guests. He didn't have guests, and set them both on the counter. She took the towel. She looked at the coffee. "I'm 9, she said. "Hot chocolate isn't a thing I keep," he said. She considered this, then took the coffee. He sat on the other stool and held the watch in both hands, and didn't say anything for a while. The rain had eased slightly, the worst of it moving east. The neon in the window had stopped flickering and settled into its steady red pulse. Somewhere outside, a dog was barking in short, furious bursts that eventually stopped. "Your mom know where you are?" he said. "I left a note." "That's not what I asked." She wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "She works the evening shift at the hospital. I didn't want to bother her at work." She paused. "She worries." He filed that away without comment. The watch ticked between his fingers. He turned it over once, felt the engraving with his thumb the way he'd done 1,000 times, and thought about his father with the particular brand of grief that doesn't announce itself. The kind that just sits there, quiet and enormous, behind everything else. Thomas Vale had died 8 years ago, a Tuesday morning in February, a cardiac event that the doctor described as massive and fast and probably painless, and Gideon had been 3 states away at the time, not answering his phone because he'd been in the middle of a dispute with a former club associate that had required his full attention. He'd gotten the voicemail from his sister at 11 that night. He'd never fully forgiven himself for that Tuesday. The watch had been at Thomas's bedside at the end, wound and ticking, because the old man never let it stop. Do right by your people. He'd said those words to Gideon the morning he shipped out for basic training, handed him the watch, told him to bring it back. Gideon had brought it back 4 times, from 2 deployments, from a decade with a club he didn't talk about anymore, from a marriage that had ended with his wife leaving and his daughter going with her. He'd brought it back every time. He just never quite managed to live by what was written on the back. He closed his fist around it. "You hungry?" he said. Wren looked up. "A little. There's a place 2 blocks down. Manny's. They do soup." She looked at the window, at the rain, at him. "I'll call them," he said. "They'll bring it." He did. Manny Ortega had been feeding Gideon Vale for 15 years and asking very few questions about it, and he sent over 2 bowls of chicken pozole and a sleeve of crackers without comment. By the time the food arrived, the rain had dropped to a steady drizzle, and Gideon and the girl sat on opposite stools eating soup in the light of the work lamp with the watch between them on the counter and the neon pulsing red and slow outside. She ate quickly, the way kids eat when they're not sure the food is guaranteed to still be there if they slow down. He noticed it without saying anything. "The man at the pawn shop," Gideon said. "Vince. He know your name?" She paused her spoon above the bowl. "He asked me." "You give it to him?" "A beat." "I gave him a wrong name." Something pulled at the corner of his mouth. Good instinct. She looked at him with those serious brown eyes. "My mom says don't trust people who smile too much." "Your mom's right." He watched her go back to the soup and thought about what she'd said, turning it over the way he turned the watch. Vince Calder had offered a 9-year-old girl $30 for a dead man's watch, and she'd turned it down and gone to the library to find the rightful owner. $30 was not an insignificant amount of money to a child whose mother was working hospital evening shifts and leaving notes for her daughter instead of being home. He knew without knowing more than that. He'd grown up in a house that understood the specific arithmetic of choosing between things. The front door opened. She came in fast, rain-speckled, still in her scrubs with a hospital ID badge swinging from the lanyard around her neck. She was tall, nearly Gideon's height, with dark circles under her eyes that weren't from the night's rain and hair pulled back in a bun that had mostly escaped into loose strands around her face. She looked around the shop in a single sweep, saw Wren, and her face did something complicated, relief collapsing into the kind of controlled anger that people wear when they've been frightened. "Wren Elise Mercer," she said. The girl set down her spoon. "Hi, Mom." Elena Mercer looked from her daughter to Gideon Vale, and he watched the shift happen. The brief recalibration that happened when people encountered him for the first time and had to process what they were seeing. He was used to it. He sat still and let her assess. "Mr. Vale," she said, and her voice was steady, though not quite. "I'm Elena Mercer. I'm sorry if she brought something back to me," he said. "I asked her to wait inside out of the rain, that's all." Elena looked at Wren. "It's true," Wren said. A pause. Elena's eyes moved to the watch on the counter, then to Gideon's face, and something shifted in her expression. Not suspicion exactly, but an alertness, a reading of context. She was smart. He could see it in the way she gathered information before committing to a response. "She told me she found a watch," Elena said. "She found my father's watch," Gideon said. "Someone offered her money for it. She said no and spent her afternoon in the library, finding out where it belonged." Elena looked at her daughter. The controlled anger was doing something new now, softening at the edges into something harder to categorize. "You should have called me," Elena said quietly. "You were working," Wren said. Simple, final. Elena came further into the shop. She stopped at the counter and looked at the watch without touching it, then at the bowls of half-finished soup, then at her daughter wrapped in a borrowed towel with a cup of oversugared coffee. The posture of a woman calculating. Gideon had seen it before. The posture of someone managing a long series of small emergencies without enough resources for any of them. He saw it because he recognized it. He'd worn it himself for years. "Can I ask where you live?" he said. Elena looked at him, a reasonable wariness in her eyes, and beneath it a familiar exhaustion. 3 blocks north, the Darnell Building. Gideon knew the Darnell Building. Everyone knew the Darnell Building. or knew of it the way you know of a wound that hasn't closed. 4 stories of crumbling brick on the corner of Ash and 5th, owned by a property management company out of Lexington that sent rent notices on time and maintenance men almost never. Half the units had something wrong with them. The heating on the upper floors was unreliable. The buzzers didn't all work. "You've been there long?" he said. 2 years, she said. "We're fine." The words were delivered cleanly, without inflection, with the particular practiced efficiency of someone who has said them many times to many people who didn't need to know otherwise. He didn't push. He looked at Wren, who was watching her mother with an expression that was older than 9 years had any right to produce. Careful, attentive, ready to adjust. He thought about the engraving on the back of the watch. Do right by your people. He didn't know these people, but something in the equation was adding up to something he couldn't quite look away from. "I'll walk you back," he said. "Both of you?" Elena started to object. He could see it forming in her posture. And then the rain hit the roof again in a sudden renewed burst, and she looked at the door and reconsidered. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm closing up anyway." He locked the shop, turned out the work lamp, and walked them back through the wet streets of Ash Hollow with his hands in the pockets of his jacket and the watch buttoned safe inside his breast pocket, ticking against his chest for the first time in 3 days. Wren walked between them. The streets were mostly empty, the puddles reflecting the amber of the sodium streetlights, the whole town looking washed clean and a little raw, the way it always did after a hard rain. They reached the Darnell building. He looked at the facade. A notice was visible in the first-floor hallway. He could see it through the glass door from the sidewalk, taped to the mailbox panel. Even from here, in the wet dark, he could read the format, if not the text. A formal notice, official margin, institutional font. The kind of paper that only ever meant one specific category of problem. Elena had her key out. She turned at the door. "Thank you," she said. It cost her something, he could tell. She wasn't a woman who thanked people easily, which meant she meant it when she did. "Your kid walked 6 blocks in a thunderstorm to return something she could have kept," he said. "I made a phone call for soup." Wren looked up at him. "The soup was good. Tell Manny that. He'll act like he doesn't care." A pause. Something almost like a smile moved across Elena's face and was gone. "Good night, Mr. Vale," she said. "Gideon," he said. She held his gaze for one moment. Assessment, calibration, decision, and then nodded slightly. "Good night, Gideon." He walked back through the wet streets alone. He didn't go home. He went back to the shop, unlocked it, sat in the dark on the wooden stool behind the counter. He took the watch out and set it on the counter and listened to it tick in the silence. He thought about $30. He thought about library computers and wrong names given to men who smiled too much. He thought about scrubs with an ID badge still attached and a posture that said we are fine to every room it entered. He thought about a girl who ate soup like the supply wasn't guaranteed. He thought about his father. He thought about Savannah, his daughter, 26 now, somewhere in Nashville, the last address he had for her 18 months old. A phone number he hadn't called in longer than that because every time he'd composed the words, he needed to say he'd found them inadequate and put the phone back down. The failure of nerve disguised as consideration. He'd been good at that. Do right by your people. He hadn't. Not by his father at the end. Not by his wife during. Not by Savannah, who'd grown up with a father who was present in body and absent in every other way that mattered. A man who could dismantle and reassemble a V-twin engine in 4 hours, but couldn't sit through a school play without checking the exits. He sat in the dark with the watch for a long time. Outside, the rain eased to nothing. The street was quiet. Somewhere in the distance, a Harley moved through the wet night, the sound coming low and deliberate through the empty streets. Not in a hurry, the particular idol of a big twin that a man who understood engines could identify the way another man might identify a voice. He knew that engine. He stood up and went to the window. The bike sat at the curb outside Manny's, 2 blocks down. Big, dark, unhurried. The rider hadn't cut the engine. He sat on it the way men sit when they're watching something, not when they're waiting for it. In the amber streetlight, Gideon could see the back of the cut, the leather vest, the patches. But the distance and the angle kept the center patch unreadable. He hadn't seen a cut on Meridian Street in 4 years, not since he'd left. His hand moved to the watch in his breast pocket without his deciding to move it. He pressed it flat through the leather, felt the ticking against his palm, and stood very still at the window watching the bike at the curb. After maybe 2 minutes, the rider looked up. Even at 2 blocks, even in the bad light, Gideon knew the face. He'd hoped he was wrong about that. The rider held his gaze for one long moment, then rolled the throttle and pulled away from the curb without urgency, disappearing around the corner onto 5th Street with a sound that faded slow and deliberate, like a question left in the air. Gideon stood at the window for a long time after the sound was gone. In his pocket, the watch ticked. Do right by your people. But which people? The question his father had never thought he needed to specify, because to Thomas Vale the answer had always been obvious. It was less obvious when the people in question came from 2 different worlds, pulling in 2 different directions. One of them holding a child and a rent notice in a crumbling building 3 blocks north, and one of them sitting on a Harley in the wet dark, as though he hadn't ridden out of Gideon's life 4 years ago under circumstances that had left neither of them with anything clean to say. He went to the back room and opened the cabinet above the utility sink. The bottle there was half full. He looked at it for a moment. Then he closed the cabinet without taking it. He pulled out his phone and found a number he hadn't called in 6 weeks. Marcus answered on the 3rd ring, groggy, annoyed. It's Gideon. It's midnight. I know. I need you in at 7. And I need you to find out who's currently representing the tenants at the Darnell building. A pause. Property dispute. Possible notice violation. A long silence on the line, then, You all right? Find out what you can, Gideon said, and hung up. He sat back down on the stool. He looked at the watch on the counter. The second hand swept its steady circuit. He thought about the bike at the curb. He thought about the rider who'd looked up, who'd held his gaze, who'd left without a word. He thought about what it meant that Cole McCready had come back to Ash Hollow after 4 years of silence, had stopped his bike directly across from Gideon's shop on the same night a 9-year-old girl had walked through a thunderstorm to return something that couldn't be bought. Coincidence was a thing Gideon had stopped believing in during his second deployment. The world didn't arrange itself in coincidences. It arranged itself in sequences. Things happened in order, for reasons, and the reasons connected if you were patient enough to follow them. Cole McCready. Back in Ash Hollow. The same night. Whatever was coming, it wasn't finished arriving yet. Outside, the last of the rain had gone. The street was clean and dark and quiet. The neon in Vale's Cycleworks window pulsed its slow red pulse against the wet pavement, the only light left on the block, steady as a heartbeat. The watch ticked. And somewhere in the black Kentucky night, a motorcycle engine idled low and patient at the edge of town, waiting for morning. He didn't sleep. He tried. Stretched out on the cot in the back room of the shop, jacket still on, boots on the floor, the watch on the shelf above his head where he could hear it. But sleep had never been easy for Gideon Vale, and nights like this one made it impossible. Too many things moving at once behind his eyes. The girl's face, serious and unafraid. Elena Mercer's posture, that careful architecture of dignity over strain, the notice he'd seen through the glass door of the Darnell building, institutional and merciless in the hallway light. And behind all of it, Cole McCready's face at the end of 2 dark blocks, holding his gaze with the particular stillness of a man who wants to be seen but hasn't decided yet what he wants to say. At 5:30 he gave up. He put the kettle on the hot plate in the back room and stood over it in the dark, watching the element glow orange, and tried to organize the things he knew from the things he was afraid of. What he knew, Cole McCready was back in Ash Hollow. Cole had been the road captain of the Iron Hollow chapter of a club Gideon had ridden with for 11 years before walking away, and their parting had not been clean. There had been words. There had been a decision Gideon made that a number of people in that room had called a betrayal, and a decision Cole had made that Gideon had called the same thing. And neither of them had been wrong exactly, which made it worse. What he was afraid of, that Cole's presence on Meridian Street last night wasn't coincidental, that it was connected to something or someone in a way that meant the quiet Gideon had spent 4 years building around himself was about to come apart. The kettle started to steam. He poured it over instant coffee and drank it standing up in the dark, and tried not to think about the other thing. The thing underneath the Cole question, the thing he'd been not thinking about for long enough that the avoidance had become its own kind of habit. The Darnell building, Elena Mercer's face, The notice on the wall: do right by your people. The problem was that doing right had a cost, and Gideon Vale had spent most of his adult life calculating that cost and finding reasons why the timing wasn't right. The situation was too complicated. He didn't have enough left to give. He was good at that calculation. He'd gotten very efficient at it. A 9-year-old girl had walked through a thunderstorm and handed him something he'd decided to spend the rest of his life not paying. He drank the rest of the coffee and called Marcus back at 6. Marcus Reyes had been working in the shop for 3 years, and before that he'd been doing transmission work in a garage outside Bowling Green, and before that he'd been somewhere he didn't talk about, with the kind of deliberate non-discussion that Gideon recognized from his own biography. He was 38 and built like a man who'd spent years doing physical work that wasn't always legal, and he asked very few questions, and the questions he did ask were the right ones. Gideon trusted him the way you trust a tool that has never failed. Not warmly, exactly, but absolutely. Darnell Building, Marcus said, without preamble, which meant he'd already started. Property Management's Lakeview Holdings out of Lexington. They've got 6 residential properties in Ash Hollow. The Darnell Building's been cited twice in the last year by the county. Once for heating code violations on floors 3 and 4, once for a stairwell safety issue that got marked resolved, but nobody I've talked to thinks it actually got fixed. Who'd you talk to? Gideon said. My cousin lives on 2. She says they've been pushing non-renewal notices on 3 units in the last month. Month-to-month tenants, lease expired. A pause, the sound of Marcus drinking something. Selective process. All 3 families got kids. Gideon was quiet for a moment. Why those 3? He said. It wasn't quite a question. That's what I'm trying to figure out. Might be nothing. Might be they want the units vacant for renovation, raise the rents after. Might be something else. Find out, Gideon said. And find out who's in unit. He stopped. He didn't know Elena Mercer's unit number. I'll get the tenant list, Marcus said. Mercer. That the name? Yeah. A pause. The kid from last night. Her mother. Another pause, longer. Gideon. What? You sure you want to start pulling on this thread? He looked at the watch on the shelf. The second hand moved its steady circuit. Pull the thread, he said, and hung up. He opened the shop at 7. Nobody came in until 9, and when the first customer arrived, a regular, Pete Holloway, dropping off a 09 Road King for a valve adjustment, he found Gideon already under a different bike entirely, lying on the creeper in the inspection bay, staring up at the underside of an engine he'd already diagnosed twice. You sleep here? Pete said. Working? Gideon said from under the bike. Uh-huh. Pete left his key on the counter and didn't ask any more questions. The morning moved slowly. Gideon worked. He was good at working. It was the one thing that had never abandoned him. The physical logic of engines, the way a problem had a correct answer you could reach with your hands. He rebuilt a carburetor. He finished the valve adjustment on Pete's Road King. He replaced the rear brake pads on a Sportster that belonged to a woman named Carla Drew, who taught 7th grade at the middle school and had been coming to him for 4 years, and whose bike he always prioritized because she always paid on time and never complained about the wait. At 11:15, Vince Calder walked through the front door. Gideon heard him before he saw him. The particular confident stride of a man who believed his presence was an asset to whatever room he entered, the slight extra weight on the heel. He was under the Sportster when the bell above the door rang, and he took his time sliding out from under it. Vince Calder was 51 years old and carried himself like a man who'd been told he was charming by enough people that he'd stopped examining whether it was true. He was heavy-set in the shoulders, well-dressed by Ash Hollow standards. Pressed slacks, a button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, a gold watch on his left wrist that he wore the way people wear things they want others to notice. He owned the pawn shop on Meridian and 2 coin-operated laundromats, and had his name on a half-dozen other arrangements around town that didn't quite qualify as businesses and didn't quite qualify as anything else. He smiled at Gideon the way he smiled at everyone. Wide, immediate, without warmth. Heard you got your watch back, Vince said. He put his hands in his pockets and looked around the shop with the proprietary ease of someone assessing real estate. Good news travels. Gideon wiped his hands on a shop rag. Something you need, Vince? Just being neighborly. He picked up a parts catalog from the counter, glanced at it, set it back. Smart kid, that girl. Smarter than $30 worth of smart, apparently. She make you nervous? Vince laughed. It was a practiced laugh, the kind men develop when they've learned that laughing first takes the sting out of being read correctly. Why would a 9-year-old make me nervous? You tell me. The smile didn't move, but something behind it recalibrated. Vince looked at Gideon with the particular attention of a man who was accustomed to knowing more than the people around him and wasn't used to the reverse. You're a suspicious man, Gideon. I'm a careful man, Gideon said. There's a difference. Vince moved toward the counter with the slow casualness of someone who's decided to be direct, because indirect isn't working. He put both hands flat on the surface, a posture Gideon recognized from negotiating tables, and before that, from rooms where negotiations had other names. The Mercer woman, he said. Elena. She's a month-to-month at the Darnell building. Gideon said nothing. Lakeview's going to move on non-renewals in the next 2 weeks. 3 units. Hers included. He said it the way you'd say it's supposed to rain Thursday. Matter of fact, even regretful, as though the information were weather and not a mechanism. I know some people at Lakeview. I could make a phone call, put in a word. Why would you do that? Because I'm a neighborly person. The smile again. And because you're a man who knows people across this county, and some of those people have work that comes through shops like this one. I've always thought you and I could be useful to each other. The shop was very quiet. Outside, a car moved through the wet street. The fluorescents hummed above. Gideon set the shop rag down on the counter. He did it slowly and carefully, the way he did everything when he was managing the thing that lived behind his sternum. The thing that, at its worst, had landed him in 2 county lockups and 1 federal holding cell over the course of his life, and that he had spent years learning to keep on a leash. Vince, he said, I'm going to ask you to leave my shop. Vince's eyebrows went up slightly. I know what you're offering. He held the man's gaze. And I know what it cost. Leave. A beat. Vince straightened up from the counter, adjusting his shirt cuffs with the deliberate composure of a man choosing not to escalate. You're making this harder than it needs to be, he said. That's generally how I operate. Vince moved toward the door. At the threshold, he stopped and looked back, and his expression had shifted. Not angry exactly, but settled into something flatter and more honest. The performance had come down slightly. She can't afford a lawyer, Gideon, and the notices are legal. Lakeview follows the letter. Always do. He paused. Just think about what I said. He left. The bell above the door rang his exit. Gideon stood at the counter for a moment, breathing. Then he went to the back room and stood over the sink and ran cold water over his hands and looked at his own face in the small mirror above the basin. The broken nose, the scar, the lines, the eyes that had seen enough to know exactly what Vince Calder's visit meant. It meant Elena Mercer's non-renewal notice hadn't arrived yet. Vince knew about it before she did, which meant Vince had a relationship with Lakeview Holdings that was more operational than neighborly, and that the phone call he was offering to make could go 2 ways depending on whether Gideon cooperated. It meant someone had been watching. He dried his hands. He went back to the shop floor and picked up his phone and called Marcus. Get me everything on Lakeview Holdings, he said. Not just the Ash Hollow properties. Everything. Marcus was quiet for a second. That's going to take some time. Take the time. He hung up and went back to work. But the work was different now. His hands moved through the familiar motions, wrenches, rags, the careful logic of mechanical systems. But his mind was running a different calculation, one that had nothing to do with engines. At 1 in the afternoon, Wren Mercer appeared at the shop window. She was in her school clothes now, dry, her backpack on, and she looked in through the glass with both hands cupped around her face before she saw him and raised one hand in a small practical wave. He waved her in. She came through the door and stood in the middle of the shop floor and looked at the bike he'd been working on. Is that a Sportster? She said. 1988. She considered it. It's small. Tell that to Carla Drew. She set her backpack on the floor and sat on the stool without being invited, which he took as a good sign. Kids who sat without being invited were either very rude or very comfortable, and she wasn't rude. School's out, he said. Half day, parent-teacher conferences. She unzipped her backpack and produced a slightly crushed granola bar. considered it, put it back. My mom doesn't know I'm here. He looked at her. Ren. She won't mind. She likes you. She met me once. She said you were decent. She said this as though it were a technical classification, a precise category. She doesn't say that about most people. He went back to the Sportster. What do you want? I wanted to make sure you actually kept the watch. Some people say thank you, and then you never see it again. He stopped. He reached into his breast pocket and held up the watch so she could see it, then put it back. She nodded, satisfied. Okay. Then, Vince Calder came by our building this morning. He went very still, but kept his hands moving on the bike. Before school? He was in the parking lot when I was leaving, just standing there. He looked at me. She paused. He knew my name, my real name, not the one I gave him. The wrench in Gideon's hand was suddenly very present, the weight of it, the specific leverage it provided, the radius of the arc it could travel. He breathed. Did he speak to you? He said. His voice was level. He said good morning. She paused. He smiled. Gideon set the wrench down carefully on the bench. You tell your mother. She already went to her shift. You text her right now, and you tell her. She looked at him with those serious eyes, and something in them had changed slightly. Not fear, still not fear, but a heightened attention, the look of someone who has learned to read adult responses for weather patterns. Is something wrong? Text your mother, he said. Right now, while I'm watching. She pulled out her phone and typed. He watched until she hit send, then looked away. He was thinking about Vince in the parking lot at the Darnell building at 7 in the morning, knowing the girl's real name, standing where she'd have to walk past him. He was thinking about what that meant as a message and to whom it was addressed. He picked up his phone and stepped into the back room and called Elena Mercer's number. He'd put it in his phone last night. A practical decision he'd told himself was nothing more than that. She answered on the second ring, her voice carrying the particular clipped quality of someone managing the demands of a hospital floor and a personal phone at the same time. Mr. Vale. Gideon, Vince Calder was at your building this morning. He spoke to Ren. I need you to know that before you get the letter. A pause. Short, controlled. What letter? Lakeview Holdings is going to send you a non-renewal notice, probably in the next week. It's legal and it's targeted, and I'm working on finding out exactly how targeted. He paused. I'm not telling you this to frighten you. I'm telling you so you're not blindsided. Silence on the line, not the silence of someone who didn't understand. The silence of someone who understood completely and was processing it in real time. How do you know this? She said finally. Calder came to see me this morning, offered to make it go away in exchange for something I'm not going to give him. Another pause. Her voice, when it came back, had changed its register slightly. Still controlled, but with an edge underneath it that he recognized, had heard in his own voice in certain rooms. He came to you, she said. He connected the dots from last night. Because of Ren. Flat, precise. He's been watching the building, Gideon said. That's what I think. I'm finding out more. Ren's here with me, he said. In the shop. She's fine. He could hear her breathing on the other end of the line, controlled, measured, the breathing of someone keeping a very tight grip on what they want to say. I'll be home at 9, she said finally. Don't let her walk back alone. I won't. A pause. Gideon. She said it differently this time. Not the cool, careful address of the previous night, but something quieter, stripped of performance. Thank you. He said nothing to that. He hung up and stood in the back room with the phone in his hand and looked at the watch on the shelf and thought about all the ways one small honest act could become the center of something much larger than itself. He went back out to the shop. Ren was looking at the photographs on the wall, the race placards, the old shots of bikes and men. She had her hands clasped behind her back, studying them with a museum-goer's attention. Who are these people? She said. People I used to ride with. They're not here anymore? No. She looked at one photograph in particular, a group shot, 8 men, some in cuts, standing outside a building he recognized even in the faded print. He knew their faces. He knew all of their names and all of their stories, the ones they told and the ones they didn't. What happened to them? She said. Different things, he said. To different ones. He did this without pushing, which he appreciated more than he could have explained. The afternoon wore on. She did her homework on the counter, spread out with a focused quiet that the shop seemed to accommodate, the hum of work and the scratch of her pencil settling into a kind of shared rhythm. He moved between jobs. Marcus came in at 3, took one look at the girl doing homework on the counter, looked at Gideon, and said nothing, which was why Gideon valued him. Marcus pulled him into the back room at 4. Lakeview Holdings, Marcus said, keeping his voice low. It's not a standard property management outfit. It's 3 companies deep. Lakeview is owned by Meridian Property Group, which is 40% held by a private equity vehicle called Calder Goss Partners. Gideon looked at him. Calder. Vince's older brother, Raymond Calder, he's based in Lexington. He runs the equity vehicle. Marcus pulled out his phone, showed him a printout. The non-renewals at the Darnell building aren't random. All 3 targeted units are on the 2nd floor north side. I pulled the building permits. Someone filed for commercial conversion on the 2nd floor north side 8 months ago. Retail space. They're clearing the units, Gideon said. Clearing them to flip them. And the timing on the permit filing. Marcus paused. It lines up with a commercial development application for the block. Someone's trying to anchor a larger deal. The Darnell building is part of a bigger package. The shop felt different suddenly, smaller. Gideon stood with his arms crossed and looked at the middle distance and let the shape of it settle in. Vince Calder wasn't a petty opportunist. He was the local face of a real estate play that was already in motion, already documented, already several moves ahead of the people in its path. The families in those 3 units weren't collateral damage in someone's greed. They were the specific obstacle. Their presence in those units was the one thing standing between the Calders and the conversion they needed. Elena Mercer hadn't been unlucky. She'd been chosen. There's more, Marcus said. He hesitated. Marcus didn't hesitate, which made Gideon focus sharply. The permit filing. One of the co-signers on the commercial development application is a city council member, Reg Hooper. Gideon was quiet for a moment. Hooper's been on the council 12 years. 13. Marcus put his phone away. He sits on the housing committee. He said it simply and let the weight of it do its own work. Gideon looked at the floor. He thought about Elena Mercer trying to find a housing attorney in a town where the housing committee was co-signed into the problem. He thought about what legitimate recourse looked like in that particular geometry. He thought about what it meant that Vince Calder had come to his shop this morning, not with a threat, but with an offer. Because offers meant something was still in play, which meant someone was still uncertain about how Gideon Vale would move. All right, he said. All right, what? Marcus said. Keep going. He turned back toward the shop floor. Find me everything. He was 3 steps through the door when he heard the motorcycles. Not 1, not 2. The sound was plural and deliberate, coming from the street, and it had the particular texture of a group arrival. The way multiple big twins sound when they pull up together, the idle dropping in sequence as throttles close. He'd been hearing that sound for 20 years, and his body responded to it before his mind caught up. He walked to the front of the shop. Through the window, he could see them. 4 bikes parked along the curb. Big, dark, road-worn. Riders still seated, not dismounted, engines dropping to idle. The cuts were visible from here. He knew the patch. Iron Hollow MC, Ash Hollow Chapter, or what remained of it. The lead rider dismounted first. He moved with the unhurried, wait-forward gait of a man who had decided long ago to take up exactly as much space as he wanted and had never been successfully argued out of it. He was 6 feet even, broad across the chest, with a gray-streaked beard and a face that had been weathered down to something essential, all the soft parts long gone. A scar crossed his left eyebrow and continued into the corner of his eye from an incident that was part of a story Gideon knew in detail. Cole McCready had aged 4 years in the time Gideon hadn't looked at him. He looked more settled than Gideon remembered, which was either a good sign or a dangerous one, depending on what had done the settling. He stood outside the window and looked in. Gideon turned and looked at Wren, who had her pencil up and was watching the window with the expression she'd been wearing since he met her, calm, cataloging, making assessments. Go in the back room, he said. There's a couch. Take your homework. She looked at him. Is this about the watch? Wren. She closed her textbook, gathered her papers, picked up her backpack, and went through the back door without comment. It closed behind her. Gideon walked to the front door and opened it. Cole McCready stood on the sidewalk with his hands at his sides and looked at Gideon with 4 years of silence between them, and neither of them moved for a moment. Behind him, the 3 other riders were still on their bikes, present, watchful, but giving distance. That was Cole's doing. He'd always understood the value of not crowding a room before it was time. "Gideon," Cole said. His voice was the same, low, measured, with the particular economy of a man who chose words the way other men chose tools. "Cole," Gideon said. A beat. The street behind Cole was empty. The afternoon light was going, the temperature dropping with that abrupt Kentucky insistence, the first edge of real cold coming down off the ridge. "Buy you a coffee," Cole said. "I've got a kid in the back room and work on the bench," Gideon said. "Talk here." Cole looked at him steadily. Something moved behind his eyes. Not quite hurt, not quite irritation. A man recalibrating. "Fine." He took one step closer and dropped his voice slightly, though the street was empty enough that volume wasn't the concern. "You know why I'm here?" "I have a guess." "Then you know I didn't come to start anything." "You came to Meridian last night and sat on your bike across from my shop in the dark," Gideon said. "You want to tell me that's not starting something? You're going to have to explain your definition." Cole exhaled through his nose. It was the specific exhale of a man who has prepared for a conversation to be difficult and is confirming his preparation was accurate. "I needed to know you were still here." "I've been here 4 years." "I needed to know you were still here," Cole said, and the repetition carried a different weight. Gideon said nothing. Cole looked past him, into the shop, then back. "Raymond Calder's got his hand in a development play that runs through half of downtown Ash Hollow, and his brother Vince is the face in town, and they've got at least one council member locked down." He said it quickly and precisely, which meant he'd been sitting on it and needed it said. "That's not new. That's been building for 2 years. What's new is that 3 weeks ago, one of our guys, Decker, you remember Decker?" "I remember Decker." "Decker's been watching the Darnell building, not officially, personally. His sister was one of the first people Lakeview pushed out, 18 months ago. Different property, different building, same playbook." Cole paused. "He found out they've got a council vote scheduled in 6 weeks. Commercial rezoning. If it passes, the development play is legal and documented, and there's nothing left to contest." Gideon looked at him. "You've been building a file. We've got documentation, permit filings, shell company connections, meeting records, financial transfers that are, let's say, they're interesting." Cole held his gaze. "We need someone in town with clean hands who can take it somewhere legitimate, someone who knows the right people without being the wrong people." He paused. "We need you." The street was quiet. One of the bikes idled low, a steady mechanical heartbeat. Gideon looked at Cole McCready for a long moment, at the face of the man who had been his brother in every way that word meant before it didn't anymore, who had made a call 4 years ago that Gideon had called wrong, and whose making of that call had cost them both something they hadn't finished accounting for. "Why me?" Gideon said. "You've got riders across the county. Because the 3 people getting pushed out of the Darnell building include a woman you walked home through the rain last night," Cole said. "And because Vince Calder came to your shop this morning." He paused. "And because you're already in it, whether you chose it or not." The air between them was cold and still. "You've been watching my shop," Gideon said. "I've been watching Vince Calder," Cole said. "You happen to be in the frame." Gideon turned that over. It had the texture of truth, partial truth, which with Cole was usually the most honest he got. "What happened in Caldwell County?" Gideon said. 2 years ago. The thing with the Peterson property. That was Iron Hollow." Cole's jaw tightened slightly. "That was handled. It was handled rough. The situation was rough. Cole." He said it quiet, with the weight of 11 years behind it. "If I bring your file to anyone legitimate, first thing they ask me is where it came from, and if it came from Iron Hollow, everything in it gets tainted by the question of what Iron Hollow wanted out of it. You understand that." Cole was quiet for a moment. The 3 riders behind him hadn't moved. The engines idled. The cold came down. "I understand it," Cole said. "That's why I came to you." Gideon looked at the pavement. He felt the watch ticking in his breast pocket with a steadiness that felt, in the moment, almost accusatory. The back door of the shop opened. Wren Mercer put her head out and looked at Gideon and said, "There's a man at the back of the building." Everything on Gideon's body went quiet. The particular quiet of training and experience, the suspension of everything except attention. "What man?" he said. "In a gray car. He's been there for a while. He's got his phone out." She paused. "He's not from the neighborhood." Gideon looked at Cole. Cole had already turned. He said something low to the nearest rider, said a word, two at most, and the man dismounted and moved without noise around the side of the building. "Wren," Gideon said, keeping his voice level, "get back inside. Lock the back door." She looked at him once, a long look that carried too much comprehension for her age, and then she was gone. Gideon looked at Cole McCready, and the 4 years between them were suddenly a different kind of distance. Not an argument about the past, but a decision about the present. "You said I'm already in it," Gideon said. "You are," Cole said. "Then tell me everything you have on Raymond Calder." He paused. "And tell me what I'm not seeing yet, because I know there's something." Cole looked at him for one long moment, and the thing in his eyes shifted. Something complicated unlocking, something that had been held in suspension for 4 years beginning to move again. "There's a girl," Cole said. "Not Wren. Someone Decker found 3 months ago. A witness to how Lakeview's been operating. If she talks, the whole structure falls." He paused. "If she talks." He let the conditional hang in the cold air between them. The bike engines idled. The last of the afternoon light bled out of the Kentucky sky. And somewhere behind the shop, in a gray car with a phone, someone was doing exactly the same thing Cole had said he'd been doing, watching the frame. The difference was that whoever was in the gray car wasn't an old brother with complicated motives, and they hadn't come to offer help. The rider Cole had sent around the building came back in under 2 minutes. His name was Taft. Late 30s, lean in the way men get when they've burned through everything soft, a scar across the back of his right hand that disappeared under his cuff. He came around the corner of the building at a walk that was almost casual and would have fooled anyone who didn't know how to read the set of a man's shoulders. Cole read it. So did Gideon. "Gray Civic," Taft said, stopping beside Cole without looking at Gideon. "Plates are county. Guy's gone. Left when I came around the corner." He paused. He had time to get what he came for. "Which was," Gideon said. Taft looked at him then. "You and Cole talking on the sidewalk. Your shop. Your address." He said it without inflection. "Whoever sent him already knew where to send him. They just wanted confirmation you were in contact." Gideon stood very still. He thought about the sequence. Vince Calder in his shop this morning with an offer. The gray car at the back of the building this afternoon. The timing between them, 5, 6 hours. Not long enough for Vince to decide to escalate. Long enough for Vince to make a phone call and for someone else to decide. "Vince didn't send him," Gideon said. Cole was watching him. "No." "Raymond. Probably someone working for Raymond." Cole glanced at Taft. A brief exchange of something. A whole conversation in 2 seconds. "Raymond Calder doesn't use his own people for this kind of thing. He uses contractors." "What kind of contractors?" Gideon said. Cole didn't answer immediately. He looked at the street, at the building, at the cold Kentucky air settling in for the night. He had the expression of a man deciding how much of a load to put on a bridge he wasn't sure about. "Come inside," Gideon said. He said it to Cole. To one man. Cole nodded at Taft without turning, and Taft went back to the bikes, and the other riders stayed where they were, which meant Cole had told him this was how it would go before they arrived. They'd planned for this conversation. They'd planned for Gideon to say, "Come inside." That meant they'd planned for him to say yes to something. He held the door. Cole walked into the shop and stood in the work lamp light, with his hands loose at his sides, and looked around the space with the particular attention of a man who had known Gideon Vale for a long time and was reading the room the way you read a person. The bare hooks on the pegboard, the photographs on the wall, the absence of the club patch behind the counter where it used to hang, the single stool, the single coffee cup. "You've been alone a long time," Cole said. "Don't," Gideon said. Cole turned to look at him. He let it go. Gideon pulled the stool out and sat on it and crossed his arms and looked at Cole McCready standing in the middle of his shop floor in a leather cut with the iron hollow patch centered on his back and said, "The witness. Tell me about her." Cole sat on the edge of the bench. Not fully, not relaxed, the posture of a man who might need to move quickly. "Her name is Dara Fenn. She's 32. She worked for Meridian Property Group as an office administrator for 3 years. Lexington office. Raymond Calder's operation." He paused. 8 months ago, she started keeping copies. Of what? Eviction coordination, targeting criteria, internal communications about which tenants to move on and in what order. He held Gideon's gaze. And financial records showing payments from Meridian Property Group to 2 city council members. Hooper's one, the other's Linda Marsh. Gideon absorbed this. Marsh chairs the zoning committee. Correct. So the rezoning vote isn't a vote, Gideon said. It's a transaction. It's been a transaction for 2 years. They've been building toward it slowly, property by property, clearing tenants, consolidating blocks, keeping it below the threshold that would trigger a formal review. Cole paused. Dara Fenn has the records that show the full picture. Payments, communications, property filings, the chain of evidence that connects Raymond Calder directly to the council members. Where is she? Cole was quiet for a beat too long. Cole, Gideon said. 3 weeks ago, she was in a safe house in Harlan County. One of our people was keeping an eye on her. He stopped. Was, Gideon said. She moved. She spooked, and she moved, and we lost contact with her. His voice carried something in it now, the edge of a man delivering information he is not proud of. 5 days ago, Decker got a message from a number we didn't recognize. Burner phone, 3 words. He paused. Ash Hollow, soon. The shop was very quiet. Gideon uncrossed his arms. He looked at the floor for a moment, then back up. You think she's coming here? I think she came here, Cole said. I think she's already in Ash Hollow, and I think she's been here for at least 3 days, and I think Raymond Calder's people think the same thing, which is why there was a gray car behind your building this afternoon. He paused. Dara Fenn knows about you, Gideon. She found your name in the files. You're in the Meridian Property Group documentation. Everything in Gideon's body went cold. What? You own this building, Cole said. Vale's Cycle Works. This property. You've owned it for 9 years. He held his gaze steady. Raymond Calder's development application includes this block. Your property is listed in the acquisition target documents. They need your land to complete the anchor parcel. Gideon sat very still. He thought about Vince's visit that morning, the offer to make Elena Mercer's non-renewal go away, the framing of it. I know some people. I could make a phone call. I've always thought you and I could be useful to each other. Not just about Elena Mercer, not just about the Darnell building, about this building, about his property, about the fact that Gideon Vale was the one piece of the Calder development plan that could not be legally forced, could not be quietly processed through a shell company and a council vote, and that Vince had come to find out whether Gideon could be persuaded or whether he needed to become a different kind of problem. They want this shop, Gideon said. They want the whole block, Cole said. Your shop is the corner parcel. Without it, the development footprint doesn't qualify for the commercial zoning designation they need. Your building is the keystone. He paused. Vince didn't come here today just about Elena Mercer. He came to see if you were going to be a problem. Gideon looked at the photographs on the wall. He looked at the tools on the pegboard. He looked at the bare hooks where things had been sold off, and the stool where a 9-year-old girl had sat doing her homework 3 hours ago, and the counter where the watch had been placed last night, like something that had found its way home after years of being lost. He thought about his father, who had bought this building with 30 years of savings and handed the deed to his son the month before the cardiac event that killed him on a Tuesday morning in February. You stay put this time. That was what Thomas Vale had said when he handed over the paperwork. Not I love you, not I'm proud of you, just you stay put this time. And Gideon had. He had stayed put for 9 years through everything. Through the lean years and the bankruptcy scare and the dissolution of the club and the end of his marriage and the long silence with Savannah. He had stayed in this shop on this block in Ash Hollow, Kentucky, because his father had asked him to. And now staying put had made him the keystone in someone else's plan. The back door opened. Wren appeared in the doorway between the back room and the shop floor. She looked at Cole, a full assessment, head to toe, the way she'd looked at Gideon the first night. And then she looked at Gideon. "My mom's here," she said. He hadn't heard a car. He stood up fast. Elena Mercer came through the back door behind Wren, still in her scrubs, her hospital badge clipped to her pocket. She stopped when she saw Cole McCready in the middle of the shop floor. Her eyes moved across him, the cut, the patch, the face, with the calm, clinical precision of someone trained to triage unfamiliar situations. "Mr. Vale," she said. "Gideon." He moved toward them. "Elena, this is—" "I know who he is." She said it without hostility but without warmth, looking at Cole with steady eyes. "Cole McCready. You were in the paper 4 years ago, the Caldwell County thing." Cole looked at her. He had the grace not to deny it. "That's right. My colleague's family was in one of those properties," she said. "It didn't end well for them. The air in the shop was very specific for a moment, weighted with the exact things that couldn't be said directly. The Caldwell situation was handled badly," Cole said. "I'm not here to argue that." "No." Elena looked at Gideon. "You called me about the notice. You said you were finding out more." Her voice was level, but underneath it he could hear what the leveling was costing her. "Tell me what more is." He told her. He took the time to tell her clearly, without softening and without overdoing it. The shell company structure, Raymond Calder's equity vehicle, the connection to Lakeview Holdings, the council members, the development plan, the rezoning vote in 6 weeks. He told her that the 3 targeted units in the Darnell building were targeted because they were on the north side second floor of the conversion footprint, not because of anything her family had done or failed to do. He told her about Dara Fenn. He told her about his building. Elena listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she stood very still for a moment, and Wren stood beside her and also said nothing. And the watch ticked in Gideon's pocket, and the shop hummed around them, and outside the first serious cold of the Kentucky night pressed against the windows. 6 weeks, Elena said. "To the vote. After the vote, it becomes structural. Before the vote, it's still contestable." He paused. "But only if Dara Fenn comes forward. Without her documentation, what we have is circumstantial. Shell company connections, timing correlations. A good lawyer pokes holes. And you don't know where she is." "Not yet." Elena looked at Cole. "Your people lost her." "Yes," Cole said. "And now Raymond Calder's people think she's in Ash Hollow." "Yes." She turned back to Gideon. Something in her face had settled into a kind of terrible clarity. The expression of someone who has done the arithmetic and arrived at an answer they didn't want. If she's here and they're looking for her, then anyone associated with this— She stopped. "Is in the frame," Gideon said. "Yes." She looked at Wren, just for a moment, long enough. "You need to find her first," Elena said. "I know. And you need to get whatever she has somewhere it can't be buried." She paused. "A lawyer, a journalist, someone outside of Ash Hollow's jurisdiction." "I know what needs to happen," Gideon said. "I'm working on the how." Cole moved then. He reached inside his cut and produced a folded piece of paper, a printout, slightly creased, and set it on the counter. "Decker's contact, the burner number she used." He looked at Gideon. "We've been running the cell tower data. The ping location for that message puts her within a half-mile radius of Meridian Street." Gideon looked at the paper. Then he looked up. "She reached out to Decker," he said slowly. "Not to you, to Decker." "Why Decker specifically?" Cole was quiet for one beat. "Because Decker's sister," he said. "Decker's sister was one of Lakeview's first evictions. Dara Fenn processed the paperwork." Gideon stared at him. "She processed it." "She didn't know what she was part of then," Cole said. "Not fully. When she figured it out, she went back through her own files and found what she'd touched." He paused. "Decker's sister is one of the names in her documentation. She kept a record of what happened to her. That's why she trusted Decker's number." Something moved across Gideon's face. Not anger exactly. Something older. "She's been carrying guilt," he said. "She's been carrying evidence," Cole said. "Both," Gideon said. "She's been carrying both." The shop was quiet. The neon outside pulsed its slow red against the window glass. And then Wren, who had been standing beside her mother with her hands in her sweatshirt pocket and her eyes moving between the adults with the careful attention of someone reading a room for the things not being said, looked at Gideon and said, "The woman in 2C." Every adult in the room looked at her. Wren's expression didn't change. She moved in 5 days ago. She said she was visiting her aunt, but she doesn't have an aunt. She said so herself when Mrs. Okafor asked. She keeps her curtains closed. She ordered food delivery twice and paid cash. She paused. She's about this tall. She held her hand level with her own chin. Dark hair. She looks tired. Elena was looking at her daughter with an expression Gideon couldn't quite classify, somewhere between alarm and a profound, helpless pride. "Wren," Elena said quietly. "I notice things," Wren said simply. Gideon was already moving. He pulled on his jacket, put the watch in his breast pocket, and looked at Cole. "Stay here. Both of you stay here." He looked at Elena. "Lock the back door. Don't open it for anyone who isn't me or Marcus." "I'm going with you," Cole said. "You're not," Gideon said. "If Raymond's people see an Iron Hollow cut walking into the Darnell building, they'll know exactly what it means. I'm a neighbor. I'm a nobody from Meridian Street." He looked at Cole's face, at the resistance there, and the thing beneath the resistance that was something closer to fear, the specific fear of a man who has miscalculated before and knows the cost. "I'll be back in 20 minutes. Cole held his gaze for a long moment, and then he nodded once. Gideon went out the front door. He walked the 3 blocks to the Darnell building at a pace that was not hurrying. Hurrying drew attention, and the street had 2 cars on it that he didn't recognize, both parked, both running. He kept his hands in his jacket pockets and walked in a straight line and looked at nothing except what was directly in front of him, the way he'd walked through other kinds of difficult places in other kinds of difficult years, burning calm from the outside, while the inside did whatever it needed to do. The Darnell building's front door buzzed open on his second try with the code Elena had given him, her own unit's code, which apparently still worked on the main entry, which told him something about Lakeview's maintenance of the security system. Unit 2C was at the end of the North Hall. He walked to it. The hallway smelled of old carpet and something institutional, the particular smell of a building that was being quietly allowed to decline. A light was out above the stairwell. The heating radiator ticked and hissed. He knocked. Silence. He knocked again. "My name is Gideon Vale. I own the cycle shop on Meridian. I'm not with Raymond Calder." He paused. "Decker sent me." He heard the chain before the door opened, the sound of it being released, which meant it had been on, which meant she'd been waiting for someone to come and had prepared for it to be the wrong someone. The door opened 6 inches. Dara Fenn looked at him with the eyes of someone who has been afraid for so long that the fear has calcified into something harder and more functional. She was roughly 32, as Cole had said, dark-haired, thin in the way people get thin when they're running and not eating on any schedule. There was a bruise along her left cheekbone, yellowed to the outer edge, 4 or 5 days old. Her right hand was behind the door. Gideon kept his hands visible. "I've got a girl downstairs who noticed you moved in," he said, "which means other people can notice. You need to move." She stared at him. Her eyes moved across his face the same way Elena's had, reading, assessing, deciding. "Decker trusts you?" "Decker and I haven't spoken in 4 years," he said. "Cole McCready trusts me. Take that for what it's worth to you." A pause. "What's it worth to you?" "Not much some days," he said honestly. "Tonight it's enough to walk 3 blocks in the cold to find you." Her jaw tightened. She looked past him down the hallway, then back. "There are 2 men in a car outside." "I know. I counted 2. There was a 3rd one earlier, in the back." "He's gone." He paused. "They don't know which unit. Not yet. But this building has 6 people who talk to each other, and your curtains have been closed for 5 days. She looked at him. The hand behind the door moved. "You have somewhere to put me that isn't someone's spare bedroom," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "And whatever I have—" She stopped. "Whatever I brought, it stays with me." "It stays with you," he said. Another pause, longer. The hallway radiator hissed. Somewhere above them, a door closed. "Give me 2 minutes," she said. She shut the door. He stood in the hall and counted his own heartbeats and waited. And in 2 minutes, the door opened again, and Darafen came out with a backpack on her shoulders and a look on her face that he recognized from places he'd been. The look of someone stepping into open ground after a long time in cover, every nerve alive, already mapping exits. He walked her out the back and through the side streets with his body between her and the 2 cars out front, and she moved without being told to, keeping pace, keeping close. She didn't speak. He didn't either. The cold had settled fully into the night air now, and their breath came in small clouds, and above the rooftops the first stars of the evening were hard and white against the dark. He got her to the shop in 11 minutes. Cole McCready was still standing in the middle of the shop floor. When Dara Fenn walked through the back door and saw him, she stopped hard, one hand going to the strap of her backpack. Cole looked at her. Something moved across his face. Recognition, and something more complex underneath it. "You're McCready," she said. "Yes," he said. "The Caldwell County property," she said. "There were families displaced. Your people were wrong," Cole said. "In how they handled it, yes." She stared at him for a long moment. The backpack strap tightened under her hand. "That's not good enough." "I know it's not," he said. "It's what I've got." A silence stretched between them, taut and specific. 2 people measuring each other across the distance of something that couldn't be undone, only acknowledged. Gideon watched it and said nothing. Some conversations needed to happen without intervention. Then Dara Fenn unslung the backpack and set it on the counter. And that was its own answer. She unzipped the top compartment and produced a hard drive. Black, palm-sized, the kind you could buy anywhere. She held it up and looked at Gideon. 3 years of records, she said. Payments, communications, targeting criteria for every Lakeview property in 6 counties. She paused. And something else. Something that isn't in the official records. "What?" Gideon said. She put the hard drive on the counter beside the watch. "The buildings Lakeview has been acquiring," she said, "the ones they've been clearing tenants out of. 4 of them, across the 6 counties, have asbestos abatement records that were filed with the county but don't match the actual inspection reports." She paused. "The inspectors who signed off on the reports, 2 of them work for a company that Raymond Calder is a silent partner in." The shop was completely still. "He's been putting families in buildings with unaddressed abatement issues," Gideon said slowly, "and filing falsified records to avoid remediation costs," she said, "for at least 3 years. She looked at him steadily. In her face he saw the weight of what she'd been carrying. Not just fear, not just guilt, but the specific terrible knowledge of someone who had processed the paperwork without seeing it clearly, and then had seen it clearly, and had not been able to unknow it. "The Darnell building," Elena said from the back doorway. Everyone looked at her. Elena Mercer stood in the doorway between the back room and the shop floor with Wren beside her, and her face was doing something completely different from anything it had done before. Not the careful architecture of managed composure, but something stripped down to its absolute core. The face of a mother doing arithmetic she didn't want to finish. "The Darnell building," she said again. "North side, 2nd floor, our unit." Darafen looked at her. In her eyes was the recognition of someone hearing a name they already knew. "I need to see the inspection records for the Darnell building," Elena said. Her voice was very quiet and very precise. "Right now." Darafen opened the backpack again, and in the work lamp light of a motorcycle shop on Meridian Street in Ash Hollow, Kentucky, with the watch ticking on the counter and the Harley engines idling cold outside, and 2 men in a car 3 blocks away who had not yet found what they were looking for, Gideon Vale watched Elena Mercer's face as she read the document that Dara Fenn placed in her hands, and saw the exact moment when the world as she had understood it came. Elena didn't make a sound. That was the thing that hit Gideon hardest. Not crying, not cursing, not the sharp intake of breath he expected. She read the document in complete silence, her eyes moving down the page with the focused precision of someone who had spent years reading medical charts, translating clinical language into human consequence. When she finished, she set it down on the counter with both hands flat on the paper and looked at the wall above the pegboard and breathed. Wren was watching her mother. "How long?" Elena said. Dara Fenn's voice was careful. "The last inspection on the Darnell building's north corridor was 14 months ago. The filed report says clean. The actual inspection..." She stopped. The actual findings were flagged for remediation. Friable material in the wall cavities between units 2B, 2C, and 2D. The remediation was never ordered because the filed report says it wasn't needed. Elena's hands pressed harder on the paper. Wren has had a cough, she said, since October. Nobody spoke. Cole moved first. He looked at Gideon and something passed between them. Not a plan, not yet, but a direction. The kind of look that men exchange when the conversation is over and what comes next isn't conversation. Marcus, Gideon said. Marcus was already at the back bench, phone out. I'm on it. I know a county health inspector in Harlan who owes me. If he calls this in tonight as an anonymous tip, the county has to respond within 48 hours. Make it happen, Gideon said. He turned to Dara Fenn. The hard drive. What format is the documentation in? PDFs, spreadsheets, scanned originals for the financial transfers. She paused. I have a contact at the Lexington Herald-Leader. I've had her name in my phone for 2 months and I haven't called. Call her tonight. If I call her tonight, Raymond knows by morning. Raymond already knows you're in Ash Hollow, Cole said. The only question is whether you get the information out before he can move on it. Dara looked at the hard drive on the counter. She picked it up and held it, and the weight of it, small, negligible, physically, seemed to cost her something visible. Then her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. The color left her face. It's the burner number, she said. Someone texted the burner I used to reach Decker. Gideon crossed to her in 2 steps and looked at the screen. 1 message, no name, 4 words. We know the shop. The front window exploded. Not a gunshot. A brick, wrapped in a work rag to kill the tumble, moving fast and flat through the glass and hitting the far wall above the tool bench with a crack that shook the photograph frames. Glass came across the floor in a wave. The neon sign in the window frame swung on its bracket, flickered, held. Wren hit the floor without being told. Elena was down a half-second later, pulling her daughter flat, both of them behind the service counter. Gideon was moving before the glass finished falling, toward the front, low, to the side of the window frame, back against the wall, looking out through the broken frame at the street. 2 men on foot, moving fast across the street from between parked cars. Not running, tactical pace, controlled, the gait of people who had done this before. One was big, the other smaller and faster. The smaller one had something in his hand that wasn't a phone. Cole, Gideon said. Cole was already at the back door. He pushed it open and put 2 fingers in his mouth, and the whistle that came out was sharp and specific, a signal. And from 3 blocks away, the Harley engines answered, revving hard, moving. Gideon picked up the longest wrench on the bench beside him. He held it low. The front door opened. The bigger man came through first. He was broad, mid-40s, wearing a jacket that was too thin for the Kentucky cold, which meant he dressed for mobility. His eyes swept the room in a single professional arc. Threat assessment, exit mapping, and landed on Gideon against the wall. Vale, he said. Just the name, like a statement of business. Shop's closed, Gideon said. The man's eyes moved to the counter where Elena and Wren were down, then to the back of the shop, then back to Gideon. He was counting people, running numbers. The drive, he said, and the woman, that's all. Neither of those things is yours, Gideon said. The second man was through the door now, smaller, faster, his eyes doing something different. Not professional assessment, but something edgier, less controlled. He had a telescoping baton in his right hand, extended, held low against his leg. He was looking at the back of the shop, looking for Dara Fenn, and Gideon could see in the angle of his attention that he was about to move toward the back bench where she was standing, and that was not going to happen. Gideon moved, not with the wrench. The wrench was in his left hand, and what he moved with was his body, his weight, the full 200 pounds of a man who had spent decades making himself hard to move through. He went directly at the bigger man, closing the distance before the man could adjust, driving his shoulder into the man's chest and taking him backward into the door frame. The impact was loud and total. The man hit the frame hard, grunted, grabbed for Gideon's jacket. The smaller man was moving. Cole came through the back door like a door coming off its hinges, fast, straight, no hesitation, and hit the smaller man at the midpoint of the shop floor with his forearm across the man's chest and drove him sideways into the bench. The baton hit the concrete floor and rang once and skidded. The smaller man came up fast and swung, and Cole took it on the forearm and answered with something short and precise to the man's solar plexus that dropped him to one knee. Gideon and the bigger man were against the wall. The man was strong, genuinely strong, not gym-trained, but work-strong, the kind of strength built by doing physical things for years. And he had Gideon's jacket in both fists and was trying to change the geometry, trying to get leverage. Gideon let him work for it. Let him burn energy fighting the weight. Then he shifted his hips, broke the grip on one side, and drove his elbow into the man's jaw. The man's head snapped back into the doorframe a second time. He didn't go down. He shook it off and spat and looked at Gideon with eyes that had gone from professional to something more personal. "Walk away," Gideon said. He was breathing hard. "Right now. Walk away." "Can't do that," the man said. Outside, the Harleys arrived. The sound of four big twins pulling up hard outside the shop was not subtle. It was not designed to be. It came through the broken window frame like a physical presence, the rumble of it filling the room, and Gideon watched it move across the bigger man's face, the calculation happening behind his eyes. What was on this side of the door versus what was on the other side? Taft came through this broken window frame. Not the door, the window, stepping through the frame with glass crunching under his boots, and stood in the shop with his arms loose and looked at the room. The smaller man was on his knees, one hand on the floor. Cole stood over him, breathing. The bigger man was against the wall looking at Gideon, then at Taft, then at the window where two more Iron Hollow riders were visible in the cold air outside, not moving, not needing to. "The drive isn't here anymore," Gideon said. It was a lie, and it wasn't. Marcus had the drive in his jacket pocket, and Marcus had gone out the bathroom window 4 minutes ago, which Gideon had told him to do with a look and a tilt of his head the moment the brick came through the glass. "And the woman you came for is already gone." The bigger man looked at him for a long, still moment. "Raymond's going to hear about this," he said. "I'm counting on it," Gideon said. The two men left. Not fast, with the specific controlled exit of people who were making a choice to leave rather than being forced out, preserving what they could of the geometry. The door swung behind them. Their footsteps crossed the glass on the sidewalk, and then they were in a car, and the car was moving, and the Harley engines watched them go. The shop was destroyed. Glass across the floor, the bench knocked sideways, tools scattered. The neon sign still swung in the broken window frame, the red pulse of it steady against the dark street. The photographs on the wall were intact. The watch was on the counter where it had been. Elena came out from behind the service counter. She stood up slowly, one hand on the counter, and looked at the room. Wren came up beside her and stood very straight and didn't say anything. Cole looked at Gideon's. There was blood above his eyebrow from the man's swing, not deep, but running freely, the way face cuts do. He didn't touch it. "Marcus has the drive?" he said. "Marcus has the drive," Gideon said. "Dara?" "She went out the back before they came through the door." He paused. "She had the contact number. She knows what to do with it." Cole was quiet for a moment. "Raymond's going to move fast now. Tonight, maybe. Tomorrow at the latest. When those two report back—" "I know," Gideon said. He looked at Elena. She was looking at him with the stripped-down expression she'd had when she'd read the inspection document, clear-eyed, precise, all the performance gone. In that moment, in the red pulse of the damaged neon with glass across the floor of his father's shop, she looked like the most honest thing in the room. "You need somewhere safe tonight," he said. "Both of you." "Where?" she said. He looked at Cole. Cole looked back at him with 4 years of complicated history between them, and underneath it, something that had survived the 4 years intact, the thing that had been there before the argument, before Caldwell County, before the clean break that wasn't, the thing that made brothers out of men who had no other word for it. "The chapter house," Cole said, "north of town. It's not comfortable, but nobody's going to walk through that door without us knowing." Elena looked at Gideon. The question in her eyes wasn't about comfort. "I'll be there," he said. "I'm not sending you somewhere I'm not." She held his gaze for one long moment, and then she nodded. Wren picked up her backpack from behind the counter. She'd pulled it down with her when she hit the floor, Gideon realized, the way you'd grab the thing that mattered, and slung it over her shoulders. She looked at the broken window, at the glass, at the watch on the counter. "Are you going to be okay?" she said. She was looking at Gideon. He looked at her. This 9-year-old girl in a wrecked motorcycle shop on a Thursday night in Ash Hollow, Kentucky, who had started all of this by walking 6 blocks through a thunderstorm with a cardboard box and a refusal to take $30 for something that didn't belong to her. He picked up the watch from the counter and held it in his fist. "Yeah," he said. Outside, the Harleys idled, the cold pressed through the broken window. And somewhere in Lexington, in an office or a car or a room Gideon had never seen, Raymond Calder was picking up a phone. And the call he was about to make was not going to be the last one tonight. And the people on the other end of it were not going to be told. The call Raymond Calder made that night went to a man named Stills, who worked out of a private security firm in Louisville that didn't advertise and didn't need to. Stills had 4 men available on short notice and a standing arrangement with Raymond's equity vehicle that dated back 3 years. To the first time a tenant in a Lakeview property had needed to be discouraged from pursuing a complaint. The arrangement had always been efficient. It had always been quiet. It had always worked because the people on the receiving end of it had been alone. This time they weren't alone. Gideon learned about the call from Decker, who had a source inside the Louisville firm, a mechanic who serviced their vehicles and had, over the course of 2 years, developed a discreet relationship with Iron Hollow that involved information flowing one direction and certain repair bills being significantly reduced in the other. The source called Decker at 11:40 that night. Decker called Cole. Cole looked at Gideon across the main room of the chapter house north of Ash Hollow and said, 4 men, 2 vehicles. They'll be here before dawn. The chapter house was a converted farmhouse on 12 acres off Route 9, surrounded by old-growth oak and backed against a ridge that made approach from 3 sides impractical for vehicles. Gideon had been here before, years ago, when this was still a room he had standing rights in. It smelled the same: oil, wood smoke, old leather, the particular layered smell of a space that had absorbed decades of men who didn't talk much and worked with their hands. The main room had a long table, mismatched chairs, a wood stove that Taft had going within 20 minutes of their arrival. The walls held plaques and photographs and a large county map with markings Gideon didn't ask about. Elena and Wren had taken the back bedroom. Gideon had heard Wren ask if there was a lock on the door, heard the writer named Pollard, quiet, broad, a Vietnam-era tattoo on his forearm that put him in his late 60s, tell her yes and show her how to use it, and heard Wren say thank you with the same crisp practicality she brought to everything. Elena had not slept. He knew this because at 2 in the morning, when he came in from walking the perimeter with Taft, she was sitting at the long table with a cup of coffee going cold in front of her, and the inspection document folded in her hands. He sat across from her without being asked. The wood stove ticked and breathed. Outside, the cold had gone deep and complete, the kind of cold that settled into the ground and stayed. One of the riders was outside at the tree line. 2 more were in vehicles on the road. "She's been coughing since October," Elena said. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the document. "I thought it was the school. Other kids getting sick. I took her to the clinic twice. They said it was a respiratory irritant. Probably dust, probably nothing." "It might still be nothing," he said. She looked up at him then, and her eyes were not the eyes of a woman who needed comfort. They were the eyes of a woman who needed honesty. "The abatement issue is in the wall cavities," he said. "That means sealed, not airborne unless the walls were disturbed. Has anyone done work on your unit in the last year?" She thought for a moment. "They replaced a pipe fitting in October. Broke through the wall under the kitchen sink. October." The cough started in October. He watched her do the arithmetic. He watched her arrive at the answer and hold it. He didn't look away. "I need to get her tested," Elena said. "Tomorrow morning," he said. "First thing. Marcus knows a pulmonologist in Bowling Green who doesn't ask where the referral came from. He'll get you in." She looked at him across the table. "You're very organized for a man who lives alone in a motorcycle shop." "I've had to figure out how to get things done without the usual channels," he said. "For a long time." She was quiet for a moment. "Because of the club. Because of a lot of things." She turned the document over in her hands. "The club, Iron Hollow, Caldwell County. Your name was in Calder's files." She paused. "Not as a target, as a variable. They weren't sure which way you'd move. They still aren't." "But you moved," she said. "You didn't take Vince's offer." "No." "Why?" she said. It was a simple question, asked without pressure, The kind of question that only wanted a true answer and wasn't trying to extract anything beyond that. He looked at the wood stove. He thought about the answer for a moment, which was the only honest way to approach it. "My father left me that building," he said. "He spent 30 years paying it off. He handed me the deed and told me to stay put." He paused. "I've spent most of my adult life not doing what he asked. I wasn't going to sell it to the man who was trying to displace a woman's family." She listened to this without comment. Then, "The watch. What your father wrote on it. Do right by your people," he said. She held his gaze. "And we're your people." He looked at her directly. "You're Wren's people," he said. "That makes you mine." Elena Mercer looked at Gideon Vale across a table in a farmhouse in the Kentucky dark at 2 a.m, and something in her face did what it had been refusing to do all night. It let go of the architecture, the careful managed composure, and became simply the face of a woman who was very tired and very frightened and had found, somehow, despite every reasonable instinct against it, that she wasn't entirely alone. She didn't cry. He hadn't expected her to. She picked up the cold coffee and drank it, and looked at the stove and said, "Tell me what happens in the morning." He told her. The plan had come together in the 2 hours between their arrival at the chapter house and Cole's call from Decker. Marcus was in Bowling Green with the hard drive and Dara Fenn's contact number, and by midnight, Dara had made the call she'd been sitting on for 2 months. The journalist at the Lexington Herald-Leader, a woman named Priya Anand, who had been covering commercial real estate corruption for 4 years and had a reputation for protecting sources the way other people protected their children, had answered on the second ring. By 1 a.m, she had received encrypted copies of everything on the drive. By 2, she had confirmed 3 independent sources for the financial transfer records. The story was already written before Raymond Calder's men left Louisville. Cole had also made a call to a former Kentucky state trooper named Beale, who had left the force under circumstances that involved a disagreement with county-level political arrangements, and who had subsequently made himself useful to people who needed things documented and witnessed by someone with standing. Beale had the inspection discrepancy records and the falsified abatement filings, and he had, over the course of one phone call, identified which state-level regulatory body had jurisdiction over county inspection fraud. He had a contact there. He was making another call. The structure that Raymond Calder had spent 2 years building, the shell companies, the council relationships, the carefully sequenced property acquisitions, was load-bearing in both directions. It held everything up, and it held everything together, and when any single part of it was exposed to the right kind of pressure, it would not bend. It would break. Priya Anand's story would run in the morning edition. When Gideon finished explaining, Elena was quiet for a while. "Dara Fenn," she said. "Is she safe?" "Marcus got her to a motel in Bowling Green under a different name. She stays there until the story runs and the regulatory contact files the formal complaint. After that, going after her becomes a public liability for Raymond rather than a solution." "And the families in the other targeted units," Elena said. "At the Darnell building. Beale is going to push for an emergency injunction on the non-renewals pending the regulatory investigation. That buys time." He paused. "The county health response to the anonymous tip will lock the second-floor north side until the abatement issue is formally assessed, which means Lakeview can't touch those units while the lock is active." She processed this. Then, "And Raymond's men who are coming here tonight." He held her gaze. "That's being handled." She looked at him steadily. "I'm a trauma nurse, Gideon. I know what handled means." "Nobody's going to get killed," he said. And then, because she deserved the full sentence, "We're going to make it very clear that coming here was a mistake, and that making it again would be a larger one. That's all." She looked at him for a long moment, reading him the way she'd been reading him since the first night, carefully, precisely, making real assessments and not the ones she wished were true. "Okay," she said. She went back to the bedroom. He heard the lock. He went outside and stood in the cold with his jacket up and the watch in his hand and looked at the stars above the Kentucky ridgeline and thought about his father, about the specific shape of Thomas Vale's hands, broad and oil-stained, the same hands Gideon had inherited and spent years putting to uses his father wouldn't have approved of, and a few he would have. About a Tuesday morning in February, and a voicemail he'd listened to standing in a parking lot in Memphis with his boots in a puddle and the phone getting wet in the rain. He'd been thinking about wrong and right for a long time. His father had made it sound simple, 5 words on the back of a watch. In practice, it had never been simple. The people you were supposed to do right by had a way of multiplying beyond the ones you started with, and sometimes doing right by one of them required doing something that wasn't clean. And sometimes the men who stood beside you when you did it were men who carried their own tallies of wrong alongside the right. And none of it resolved into a clean ledger no matter how long you ran the numbers. He thought about Cole McCready. He thought about Caldwell County, the family that had been displaced, the way it had been handled, the argument he and Cole had in a room full of men who were listening, and the clean break he'd made afterward that had cost him whatever it had cost. He'd been right about Caldwell. He'd also been self-righteous about it in a way that had served his own need to walk away from something more than it had served justice, and he'd known that at the time and had walked anyway. 4 years later, Cole had come back and stood in his shop and said we were wrong to a woman he'd never met, and meant it without performing it. People could change. The thought arrived quietly, without drama, just a thing that was true. He put the watch back in his pocket and went to find Cole. Cole was at the tree line, standing with Taft and a rider named Cruz, who had the particular stillness of someone who had been standing watch in dark places for long enough that it had become a natural posture. Cole turned when he heard Gideon's footsteps. "They'll come in from the south road," Cole said. "It's the only approach for vehicles that doesn't put them on the main route." He paused. "Taft's got the south road covered from the ridge. Pollard's in the drive. Cruz is east. I know where everyone is," Gideon said. "I walked the perimeter." A pause. Something moved in Cole's face. "Old habit." "Old habit," Gideon agreed. They stood together at the tree line in the cold for a moment, the way they'd stood in other places, in other weather, over 11 years of shared biography, and the silence between them was different from the silence of the past 4 years. That silence had been a wall. This one was just space, room for things to exist in without needing to be immediately resolved. "Caldwell County," Gideon said. Cole was quiet. "I was right about the call," Gideon said, and I used being right as a reason to leave something I should have stayed and fixed." He paused. "Both of those things are true." Cole looked at the ridgeline. The cold moved through the trees. "I made the call," he said. "The family that got hurt, that's on me. That doesn't go away because I've spent time since then trying to balance it." "No," Gideon said. "It doesn't." "But you're here," Cole said. Not accusatory, just noting it. "I'm here," Gideon said. They didn't shake hands or embrace or mark it with anything that would have felt foreign to either of them. They just stood at the tree line in the Kentucky cold, 2 men in leather with complicated histories, and let it settle into the ground with the frost. The vehicles came at 4:17 in the morning. 2 SUVs, running dark, coming in slow off the south road the way Cole had said. Taft had them from the ridge the moment they turned off the main route, and the chain of information moved through the group in the time it takes light to move. Quiet, fast, without drama. Gideon stood in the farmhouse drive with Cole on his left and Pollard on his right, and the lights of the chapter house behind them. 4 other riders positioned in the dark, at angles that weren't immediately visible, but would become so if the people in the vehicles made the wrong choice. The SUVs stopped 20 yards out. Doors opened. 4 men. Stills was the one who got out first. Gideon recognized the type before he had the name. The particular build and bearing of a man whose professional history included things that didn't appear on any resume. He was in his 50s, composed, wearing a jacket that matched the temperature in a way that said he dressed for work. He looked at Gideon, he looked at the riders in the dark at the edges of his vision. He did the math. "Vale," he said. "Long way from Louisville," Gideon said. Stills said nothing for a moment. He was still running numbers. "We've got a contract," he said. "Your contract is with Raymond Calder," Gideon said. "By 6 this morning, Raymond Calder is going to have a story in the Lexington Herald-Leader, a regulatory complaint filed with the state, and a formal health code lock on one of his key properties. By 9, he's going to have lawyers trying to manage what happens next." He paused. "Your contract is going to become a liability before the sun's up." Stills was quiet. "The woman you came for isn't here," Gideon said. "What she had isn't here. It's already in the hands of a journalist and a regulatory contact and a former state trooper who documented his chain of custody." He held the man's gaze. "There's nothing here worth the exposure." One of the other men moved slightly. A shift of weight, not a decision but an instinct. Cole made a sound that wasn't quite a word, and from the darkness at the left edge of the drive, two Iron Hollow riders stepped into the ambient light of the farmhouse windows, and the man who'd shifted his weight went very still. Stills looked at Gideon for a long time. He was doing what professionals do when a calculation changes, stripping the emotion out of it and running pure logic. The exposure versus the payout, the liability versus the contract. Raymond's going to be unhappy, he said. Raymond's going to be unhappy regardless, Gideon said. That's not your problem to solve. Another long moment. The cold moved between them. Then Stills turned and got back in the vehicle. His three men followed. The SUVs reversed down the south road the way they'd come, careful and unhurried, and their lights came on when they hit the main route, and then they were gone. The riders in the dark melted back into positions. Cole exhaled beside Gideon. Not relief exactly, but the specific release of a man who had prepared for one outcome and received a better one without fully trusting it yet. That's it? Pollard said from Gideon's right. That's it, Gideon said. Pollard grunted. Anticlimactic. Good, Cole said. Climactic is expensive. Gideon turned and walked back toward the farmhouse, and the watch ticked against his chest in the cold, and above the Kentucky ridgeline, the sky had begun the barely perceptible shift from black to the deep blue that comes an hour before real dawn. The story ran at 6:03 in the morning. Priya Anand had written it with the kind of precision that made it very difficult to sue and very difficult to ignore. Shell company connections laid out in sequence, financial transfer records reproduced, the falsified inspection filings described in detail alongside the actual findings they'd replaced. The two council members named with full documentation of the payments received. Raymond Calder's name was in the 6th paragraph and in the headline. Vince Calder's name was in the 14th paragraph, a sentence that described his role as the local operational contact for a property management structure that had systematically displaced families across 6 counties, while filing regulatory records that did not reflect actual conditions. By 7:30, the state regulatory body had received the formal complaint from Beal's contact and issued a preliminary acknowledgement. By 8, the county health department had responded to the anonymous tip about the Darnell building with an inspection order that locked the second-floor north corridor pending assessment. By 9, Raymond Calder's primary legal counsel had released a statement that managed to be both lengthy and empty, the kind of statement that lawyers produce when the facts have already been published, and the only remaining strategy is to sound measured while running in the opposite direction. Vince Calder called Gideon's phone at 9:17. Gideon looked at the screen. He let it ring. He looked at it until it stopped, and then he put it back in his pocket. He was sitting at the counter of a diner called Peg's on the edge of Ash Hollow, with a cup of coffee that Peg herself had brought without being asked, because Gideon Vale had been sitting at this counter since he was 22 years old, and Peg had learned his order before he knew she'd learned it. The diner was warm and smelled of coffee and bacon grease, and the particular comfort of a place that had been making the same food in the same building for 40 years without apology. Elena and Ren were in the booth behind him. Ren had a hot chocolate and a plate of toast and was reading something on Elena's phone with the focused quiet of a child who understood that the adults around her needed a few minutes of silence and was willingly accommodating this. Elena had her hands wrapped around a coffee mug and was looking out the window at Ash Hollow, waking up in the early morning, the light coming over the ridge, the storefronts beginning to open, the street wet with last night's frost melting in the first thin warmth. Marcus came in at 9:45 and sat beside Gideon at the counter, and Peg brought him coffee without being asked because Marcus had also been coming here long enough. Darafen's fine, Marcus said. She checked out of the motel this morning. She's got a place to go. A cousin in Frankfurt. Priya Anand is going to check in with her daily until the regulatory process is active enough that she's protected by public record. He paused. She asked me to tell you something. What? She said she knows it doesn't fix what she processed when she didn't know better. She said she knows that. He wrapped his hands around the mug. She said she hopes the kid's okay. Gideon looked at his coffee. She'll be okay, he said. And then, because Marcus deserved more than that, I think she'll be okay. The pulmonologist in Bowling Green had been arranged for that afternoon. Gideon had also called a housing attorney in Lexington, a woman named Cho, who took cases involving regulatory violations and had a particular interest in tenant protection. and given her the outline of the 3 targeted families at the Darnell building. Cho had said she'd take it pro bono pending the regulatory outcome, and she'd said it the way lawyers say things when they already know the case has merit and they want to be in front of it. The non-renewals would be contested. The abatement issue would be formally assessed. The council vote in 6 weeks would face scrutiny it had not been designed to withstand. None of this was complete. None of it was resolved in the clean, final way of things that existed only in stories. There would be months of process, of counterfilings and delays, and the particular grind of institutional machinery moving at institutional speed against people who had real lives and real rent and real children. Elena Mercer would have to fight for her right to stay in an apartment that had made her daughter sick, and the fighting would be exhausting and expensive in ways that money couldn't always measure. But she wouldn't be fighting alone. Cole McCready came into Peg's diner at 10 in the morning and sat at the counter 3 stools down from Gideon and ordered coffee and said nothing for a while, which was how Cole entered most spaces, present before announced, reading before speaking. Peg looked at him. She looked at the cut on his back. She looked at Gideon. "Friend of yours?" she said to Gideon. "Something like that," Gideon said. Peg poured Cole's coffee and said nothing further, which was one of the things Gideon had always valued about Peg's diner. It had a policy of not asking questions it didn't want the answers to. Wren appeared at Gideon's elbow. She climbed onto the stool beside him with the efficiency of a child who has been tall enough to do something independently for exactly long enough to do it without thinking about it. She looked at his coffee. "Is that good?" "It's hot." She considered this. "Can I have some?" "You've got hot chocolate." "I finished it." He looked at Peg. Peg was already moving. Wren waited for her second hot chocolate with her hands flat on the counter and her eyes doing their customary survey of the room, cataloging, assessing, filing things away. She looked at Cole McCready 3 stools down with the same unfrightened attention she'd given everything since the first night. "You're the one from last night," she said to Cole. "Outside the shop." Cole looked at her. "That's right." "Your guys stayed outside," she said. "The whole time." "Yes." "That was smart," she said. "Fewer people inside means fewer variables." Cole looked at Gideon. The expression on his face was one Gideon had never seen on Cole McCready before, which was a thing Gideon had not expected to encounter after knowing the man for 15 years. It was something between startled and impressed, the expression of someone who has been assessed accurately by an unexpected source and doesn't quite know what to do with it. "She's right," Cole said to Gideon. "She usually is," Gideon said. Elena arrived at the counter and stood behind Wren with her coffee and looked at the street through Peg's front window. The morning light was stronger now, coming in at a low angle and catching the moisture on the glass. And Ash Hollow looked clean and cold and ordinary, the way it always looked from inside a warm place, all its complications invisible from a sufficient distance. "The attorney called," Elena said to Gideon. "Cho. She said she can file the contest on the non-renewal within 48 hours. "Good." She said the abatement lock complicates Lakeview's position significantly. They can't push a non-renewal on a unit that's under a health code restriction. It creates a liability argument. She paused. She sounded like she was enjoying the liability argument. "Good lawyers usually do," Gideon said. Elena was quiet for a moment. "I need to call the other families, the other 2 units. They need to know what's happening." "Do you know them?" "Mrs. Okafor on the 2nd floor. She's got 3 kids, and a man named Garza in 2B. He doesn't speak much English. His nephew translates sometimes." She paused. "They've probably gotten their notices by now." "Call them," he said. "Give them Cho's number. Tell them it's taken care of." She looked at him. "Is it taken care of?" He thought about that honestly. It's as taken care of as anything gets when the system doing the taking care of it is the same system that failed them in the first place. He paused. "But this time there's a lawyer, a journalist, a regulatory complaint, and a health code lock. That's more than they had yesterday." She held his gaze for a moment and then nodded. Wren's second hot chocolate arrived. She pulled it toward her and wrapped both hands around it and stared at the counter with the expression of someone thinking through a long sequence. "Mr. Vale," she said. "Gideon." "Gideon." She tested the name, then accepted it. "Are we going to have to move?" He looked at her. He thought about the answer before giving it, because she was 9 years old and she deserved the respect of a true answer more than she deserved a comfortable one. I don't think so, he said, but I don't know for certain yet. What I know is that there are people working on making sure you don't have to. She absorbed this. You're one of those people. Yes. Why? She said. Elena made a small movement beside her, the instinct of a parent who was about to redirect a question, and then stopped herself. Gideon saw it, saw her decide to let the question stand. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. He thought about the right words, not the easy ones. Because you walked 6 blocks in a thunderstorm, he said, to give something back that you could have kept. He paused. That kind of thing doesn't go unrewarded, not on my watch. He reached into his breast pocket and held up the silver watch. The morning light caught the metal face. The second hand was moving, as it always moved, steady and indifferent to everything it had witnessed. Wren looked at it for a long moment. It's still ticking, she said. Hasn't stopped once, he said. She looked at him. Something in her face opened slightly. Not the careful assessment she usually wore, but something younger and less defended. The face of a 9-year-old who had been carrying a weight she hadn't been designed to carry, and who was, in this warm diner on this cold morning, setting a small portion of it down. Good, she said. He put the watch back in his pocket. The diner filled slowly around them as the morning advanced. Peg's regulars, a couple of tables of workers in paint-spattered clothes who came in from a job site on the edge of town, old Pete Holloway who looked at the cut on Cole's back with the expression of someone filing information away for later discussion. The coffee kept coming. The bacon kept coming. The light through the windows shifted from pale to full as the sun cleared the ridge and Ash Hollow arranged itself into another ordinary morning, which was its own kind of miracle. The way life returned to ordinary in the spaces between extraordinary things, as though testing whether the extraordinary had changed anything permanent. It had. At 11:30, Gideon walked back to the shop alone. The glass had been swept by the time he got there. Marcus had sent someone, or Cole had. He wasn't sure which, and it didn't matter. The window frame was empty, the broken glass gone, the floor clean. Someone had righted the bench that had been knocked sideways in the fight. The photographs on the wall were straight. The tools were back on the pegboard. The neon sign in the empty window frame was dark. Its housing had cracked when the brick hit the frame, and it would need to be replaced or repaired, and that was a conversation for a different day. He stood in the center of the shop floor and looked at the space he had occupied for 9 years. The wear patterns on the concrete, the bare hooks, the photographs, the bike in the inspection bay, still waiting for work he hadn't gotten back to. His father had bought this building with 30 years of savings and handed him the deed and told him to stay put. He had stayed put, and staying put had put him in the frame of something larger than himself, had made him the keystone, the inconvenient parcel, the man that Vince Calder's offer had been designed to move. But it had also put him in the frame of Wren Mercer walking through the rain with a cardboard box, and Elena Mercer standing in his shop with her hospital badge still on, and Dara Fenn with a hard drive full of evidence she'd been too frightened to use, and Cole McCready standing at a tree line in the cold saying, "We were wrong," to the dark. Staying put had put him in all of it. He went to the counter. He picked up the watch and turned it over and felt the engraving with his thumb the way he had 10,000 times. The worn, shallow letters, his father's voice in metal, the instruction he'd spent decades failing to fulfill. Do right by your people. He looked around the empty shop. He thought about what the next weeks would look like. The attorney's filings, the regulatory process, the abatement assessment, the news cycle that would either maintain pressure on Raymond Calder's operation or be managed into irrelevance, and all the small daily work of making sure that Elena Mercer had what she needed, and Wren had what she needed, and the families in the Darnell building had what they needed while the machinery ground forward at its own pace. He thought about the honor fund, the idea that had been forming since the night Wren walked in, taking clearer shape with every hour since. Not charity, not a transaction, a mechanism for community that didn't require shame or publicity, that could move quietly and quickly to the places where people were one emergency away from collapse, funded by everyone who had something to give and administered by someone who understood the arithmetic of making it to the end of the month. He'd need to call people. Veterans he knew. Mechanics across the county. Carla Drew, the 7th grade teacher who always paid on time and never complained. Manny Ortega. People who understood what it meant to be in a town that failed its own people slowly and quietly, and who might be ready, now that the quietness had been broken, to do something loud about it. He'd need to call Marcus and tell him he was getting a raise and a full-time position and a key to the building, because that was a conversation that was 4 months overdue. He'd need to call Cho's office and offer the shop as a meeting point for the 3 targeted families, a neutral space where they could sit with a lawyer without having to navigate anything that felt institutional or frightening. He'd need to do a lot of things. He looked at the bare hooks on the pegboard. He looked at the window frame where the neon sign had been. He took out his phone and found a number he had not called in 18 months, and he stood in the center of his father's shop with his thumb over the dial icon for a long moment. He thought about inadequate words. He thought about the habit of not calling because the words weren't right, and how that habit had served his own fear rather than his daughter. He pressed call. It rang 4 times. 5. He was preparing for voicemail, composing the first sentence, which was the hardest one, when the line opened. "Dad!" Savannah's voice. 26 years old, Nashville, a life he'd watched from a distance of his own making. Her voice had the careful neutrality of someone who had answered a call they hadn't expected and hadn't yet decided what to do with it. "Hey," he said. A pause. "You okay?" she said. The care in the question was involuntary. He could hear her trying to contain it and failing slightly. And that failure was the most honest thing he'd heard in months. "Yeah," he said. "I'm okay." He paused. "I wanted to call, that's all." Another pause. "I wanted to hear your voice." Silence on the line. Not the silence of refusal. The silence of something loosening very carefully, the way ice moves in early spring, the weight of it shifting, the structure of it beginning to change, not breaking, but beginning to move in a direction it hadn't moved before. "Okay," Savannah said. Quiet, careful, genuinely open. He stood in the middle of his father's shop with the watch in his hand and the window frame empty, and the Kentucky morning light coming through the absent glass, and said, "I've got some things I want to tell you about. Things that happened this week." He paused. "If you've got some time." She was quiet for a moment. "I've got time," she said. Outside, in the clean, cold morning air of Ash Hollow, a single motorcycle moved through the street below the shop. Unhurried, the idle of a big twin running easy, no destination that required speed. The sound came through the open window frame and filled the shop the way sound fills an empty room, warm and present and entirely real. The watch ticked in his hand. The road ahead was not empty.